Previously on agentpalmer.com, 6 transcendent quotes from my podcast queue, my 2019 memoir, and of course, I need more wall space for the art Sean inspired me to add to my collection. This is the Palmer Files, episode 9, featuring the first in-person guest of the show, my very old friend, Jason Zapata, where we discuss adaptation versus interpretation, from Tolkien and Terry Brooks to Batman, Bond, and Beowulf, plus many, many more properties. It's a pop culture cornucopia. Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this episode of the podcast is Jason Zapata. This one was different in that my guest was in studio. Seriously, guys, the first in-studio guest in the history of the Palmer Files podcast. So it took a while to get adjusted, but it's easy to feel comfortable across from one of your oldest friends. Jason Zapata and I go way back. He is a published author of one book of poetry with another on the way, and a novel that I hear is eventually going to see the light of day as well. A day may come in the future of this podcast when we discuss our shared histories, but it is not this day. This day is for adaptation and interpretation across the many spectrums of good, bad, and unrelated, plus everything in between. We relive old arguments about Tolkien's seminal adaptation by Peter Jackson and discuss many book-to-screen fandoms like Shannara, Game of Thrones, Jurassic Park, Ready Player One, and many other different fandom interpretations like Star Wars, Anne Rice, and Len Dayton, to name a few. The other thing I want to say is that while this conversation was unique unto itself, it is the kind of conversation that Zapata and I have had for decades over the course of our friendship. Did I anticipate everything he would say? I did not. Did he? No, but we know each other so well that I do apologize if we skipped something as unsaid, which I don't believe we did, but it's possible. I know Zapata and I, plus any other person, have the ability to lose that one other person, and I hope we did our best to make sure we left nothing unsaid and we didn't lose you. But if we did anything you want to yell at us in either agreement or distaste, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, you can tweet the show at The Palmer Files, and you can even tweet Zapata at Zapata Wordsmith, though he hasn't been on Twitter in a while, so maybe if you welcome him nicely into the Twitter sphere, dear listener, we can change all of that. If you're interested, you can see some of Zapata's work on his site, jasonzapata.com, though he hasn't written on it for a while. You can still check it out. And of course, you can still see all of my writings on agentpalmer.com, and remember, all of these links and those mentioned in the show will be in the show notes. So, without further ado, me and my friend. Mr. Zapata, we're going to start with Lord of the Rings. I, at the very beginning, had some, in hindsight, not so major, but at the time, I thought major issues.
Reservations.
That's a good word. I had major reservations with the film franchise. And you, after a decade plus of waging the same battle and the same debate and the same discussion and the same argument and the same whatever you want to call it over and over and over, finally turned me around. It was a war of attrition that you... I don't know how. I guess just sheer will. You won. But it's as good a place to start as any for this discussion. You were on the other side. You were like, these movies are brilliant. There are no reservations.
You are certainly the purist in terms of this particular debate.
Purist is... I was an asshole. Like, I'll say it. Like, I was a dick. Like, I was totally a dick. I had one flag to fly. I mean, there were others. Don't get me wrong. Like, there are other things I could have had reservations about. All right? But I didn't. I understood why Aragorn and Arwen had their, you weren't going to take all the mythology and do a thing for everything. So they borrowed that from, I think it was like the Book of Lost Tales or Unfinished Tales or something, you know, whatever. Like that. It's a great love story between an elf and a non-elf.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I get all that, but I was just,
You gotta tell the audience.
Tom Bombadil, man. Tom Bombadil. Like, where's Tom? Tom's not here, man. They don't get out of the Shire without Tom, man. Where's Tom? I miss Tom. Tom's
I
lovely
heard this
singing
so many
singing
times,
voice,
so many years.
the poems, the songs, all the leaf. I'm just saying, I that was my argument, and you turned me around on it, surprisingly. Like, and it was a shock to me when I finally turned around. I didn't not watch them several times in theaters, all three. I didn't not buy the extended editions. You and I have watched the extended editions together, and we don't argue when we're watching that film.
No.
It's afterwards.
But you know what this movie could have needed, and I'd roll my eyes. I'm like, let me guess.
What did it need?
Tom Bombadil.
That's exactly what it needed. Yes. It's not actually that it was needed so much as it was missing, and I was very upset. I felt that the lack of Tom was a personal affront to me.
And we've discussed various theories as to why he didn't appear in the films. My strongest takeaway from it was in terms of pacing for the film, you know, getting the hobbits out of the Shire and getting them, you know, meeting Aragorn and the rest of what would be the Fellowship. That was the driving goal for the film, you know, and unfortunately, I think it would have been too much of a detour to include, you know, Tom as weighty a character as he may be for the purist. I think in terms of the pacing for the film, it would have suffered.
But to that point, because I can still go back to my arguments, he was the one that saved them from the tree, which gets moved to, I mean, Jackson keeps that scene. He just moves it to another part of the trilogy. It gets into adaptation and interpretation. And I think that on the other side, the war of attrition between us being over, like and even when we were fighting the war of attrition, I would never have said Peter Jackson did anything wrong. Like, I never really blamed him. I was just upset at something from a purist perspective because, you know, I guess it's something that helps identify me as a more of a nerd, more of an OG. Like, I read the book. I know what's missing.
Yeah.
Do you know what's missing? No, of course you don't. You watched the films. It's all you did. You didn't pick up the book. But how do you feel? Despite my issues, right? And you were always one to defend these films.
Oh, of course.
Where were you when you first watched them? Like, what was the...
Nerdvana would be the phrase I would use. The casting, the set design, the location, I mean, everything, the score, everything came together to make that particular film one of the best adaptations ever. And people argue, you know, over genre, like, oh, well, that's fantasy. That's not, you know, a drama, so it doesn't really count.
It isn't. I mean, I mean, there's drama in there. It's also, you know, kind of military. It's got some romance. It's got a little bit of lighthearted comedy because you can't have hobbits without comedy.
Of course,
I mean, that's just
second breakfast. You know, gotta have that second breakfast.
I mean, 11sies. Come on, man.
Dinner supper.
Oh, afternoon tea.
We're all hobbits on Thanksgiving too, so it's like,
dude, we're all hobbits all the time.
Could be.
All right, so you love the film. Where do you stand when I say, but Tom? Like, we haven't really given people like your side of this. Just that you kept defending them, but like, what was your defense or your offense against me being like, but Tom?
What besides, again, the aforementioned pacing issue, I would say that really, besides that initial part in the first book, he doesn't really make a reappearance anywhere else. So, you know, it's one of those things where if you're making a trilogy of movies and this person's not going to appear again in another 3.5, 4 hours worth of film, are you going to really take the time to set up a scene to have this character appear? So, there just wasn't enough payoff for poor Tom to, make his glorious entrance.
All right. And then and I was fine with it. And then The Hobbit came out, and it was like, I know who Radagast is,
Mm-hmm.
but why is he here? What's Radagast doing here?
Yeah.
All right, what's going on?
The weird Galadriel Gandalf kind of romance thing, which was like, it was kind of weird.
It's basically, right? It's the same writing crew. It's the same people I know there was the whole Del Toro stuff, and I'm not going to get into that, but
yeah,
essentially you're looking at 3 books, 3 movies. That was Lord of the Rings, all good. Then you're looking at 1 book, The Hobbit, 3 movies. And you go, you did so well adapting the first one. And I grant you, it's kind of like those, like I make it akin to the first album for a band where you've got years to like discuss the music and what songs you'd put on the album. And they'd gone over that script many times before they even sold it, right? So like then all of a sudden they get this Hobbit project dropped in their lap and they don't have as much time, but you've already been over this before. You can't look at Lord of the Rings without having a little bit of appreciation for The Hobbit. And they kind of do a 30-second version of The Hobbit at the beginning of Return of the King,
yeah,
kind of a deal. So they're not unfamiliar with it. And then they go, yeah, but there's all this other stuff. There's the Book of Unfinished Tales. There's the Silmarillion. There's the Book of Lost Tales. All this other stuff. And they're just like, we're going to add it in. And then I go like,
what happened?
What happened?
Yeah.
Like it was...
As we've discussed previously, I would say that there's that fine line between, again, adaptation and interpretation. With the Hobbit films, not unfortunately, we're talking like these, we're like, meh films. They weren't really meh films. They were good. They just weren't on the scale.
No, but you and I could easily cut out all of the like Gandalf on his own, Radagast stuff, and stick to. All right, so there was a Hobbit before Peter Jackson did it, just like there was a Lord of the Rings before Peter Jackson did it. And the Hobbit that existed was an NBC television special that Rankin and Bass did. And if I were to take the live-action Peter Jackson film and cut it so it only showed the same scenes, because those scenes exist in every adaptation, that are in the Rankin and Bass version, we end up with one movie at like 82 minutes, probably 90 or 105. Like it's going to be longer because I'm not going to cut scenes, but I'll take the scenes as they exist. You cut all the other stuff out, and I think you have a really slick film. One really slick film.
Yeah, with The Hobbit, and like anyone you talk to who watched the film said like this should never have been 3 films. Like 2 at the most. Would have been more than sufficient. And again, it was what they were choosing to include because, as I think you pointed out, there was a lot of stuff from Lost Tales and the Silmarillion they were kind of shoehorning in. And there was also depictions of the battle, the way it was, being fought. There was a lot of things that, that Peter Jackson kind of included that really wasn't in the books at all. So again, that was his interpretation of it.
Well, and it's such a stark contrast to the way he handled the first 3.
Such a very historical, very, one would dare say, purist approach to adapting the book. Where with this, he took liberties, and I'm okay with some of the liberties he took. I just think in terms of pacing, it was just.
But it depends on property now, doesn't it? It depends on property. We're talking about Tolkien, who is, as geeks, as fantasy nerds, Tolkien is in us, right? It's our lifeblood. You have another lifeblood in your DNA in Terry Brooks.
Yes.
And that's an adaptation you absolutely despised. I had to convince you to finish the first season.
Yes.
And
that was only through the uttermost reluctance and compromise that I did that. That was a true showing of our friendship right there.
But it is such a different interpretation. However, I will say the first season follows the book fairly well. Now, maybe the characters aren't as personified exactly as you wanted them to, but as the story goes,
it was fairly accurate. The main kind of factions and characters were there. The timing of their meetings, the certain events that took place were kind of a mishmash. The characterizations were I don't want to say completely off, but it was problematic for me, and the dialogue was atrocious. I'm sorry, the dialogue.
Well, they simplified the dialogue, but my point is, but okay, I had come to this later in life, right? You introduced me to the Sword of Shannara trilogy as we're recording this probably like 8 years ago, so like more recently than anything, right? I didn't grow up with it to that extent. So I'm coming at it as, well, here's all right. I mean, I like the books. I'm in. All right, let's do this. And my issues with the series start to stem from season 2 and 3, which I think they're maybe just 2.
I don't think they got to 3 even.
But because 2, whatever, after the first season, which follows book number 2 of the initial trilogy,
which is a very just not to interrupt, but just when you think about it, very interesting choice to start with 2 and not the...
No, it makes sense. Complete sense.
Well, no, I'm just saying it's interesting. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. I'm just saying it's you're starting basically in the middle of a trilogy of books. It's kind of if anything, a bold decision to do that.
Well, I mean, but now it's about integrity, right? It's about integrity and adaptation. So we know MTV was developing this series. You can't do the sword.
Sorry, I'm just a little chuckle at MTV developing that. If that wasn't a red flag amongst us Terry Brooks fans, I don't know what was. But do continue. I'm sorry for interrupting.
But I'm just saying, like, so the first one is a sausage party. There is like one half a character for half a moment that's female, basically. So you had
Fellowship. It was the Fellowship. Like, think about it.
Well, but they added in Fellowship, because we'll jump back and forth here real quick, they added in a little bit more Arwen. I guess, to be fair, we don't see Galadriel until Two Towers, right? So they just added in a little more Arwen. But it's not to the same level in Sword. And like The Hobbit, where they retell the whole story basically in 30 seconds at the beginning of Return of the King, you can kind of retell the story of the Sword as you go, because... And I'm a little fresher than you, but not by much. I know you reread those books, but like in the second book and the third book, they're always retelling the story of the Sword of Shannara. In that initial trilogy, that story, you could skip the first book and be fine, because they retell the story of the first book to other characters in the second and the third one, because it's generational and it keeps getting passed on.
It's the one of the very interesting things about that book series is it's the Onsfords. It's that particular family that down through each line, each generation, they have this epic quest, and sometimes the Lees are there, and we're kind of doing a deep dive into all the characters of Shannara now, but it's one of the very cool things about those books is like, Will Omsford had children, and now J.R.R. Omsford's going on the quest, and it's neat to see how that progresses as the multiple series goes on.
But my point is, it's a more practical series to start on book 2.
Yeah.
Like, you couldn't start at the Two Towers. That would be a lot harder, as an example. But my issue becomes, after the first season, they're in between books. The next season doesn't go to book 3. It goes to what would happen in between. And as it being genealogically a map in front of you, right? Like, we know at the end of the second book, or at the beginning of the third book, we know kind of what happened in between the books. So they were writing like, well, they can go on adventures in between the books. It's not like just, it's not like
interpretation. It was their interpretation of the material.
It's a very different kind of interpretation. It's
vastly
not
different.
It's not The Hobbit. where he's interpreting. I mean, Peter Jackson's probably a little different, and I'll grant you that as a case study, The Hobbit is odd because Peter Jackson said during production, "This is my last chance at Middle Earth." So of course he was going to go like, "Oh, well, there's like 12 other volumes of things I can borrow from," and he's stuffing it all in. But he's coming from a place of fandom, number one, and number two, he's trying to stuff as much canon as possible into these films. I mean, listen, he took some artistic liberties, but everything is based on a short story or a chapter from one of those other books, right? For Shannara, after season 1, they're literally just, okay, we know the end result. Like, okay, at the end, we know that you have a kid, Zapata. That's what we know.
Yeah.
But we can do whatever we want as long as we make sure you have a kid.
Yeah.
Like to start and that's where I can understand a purist has a bigger issue.
But ultimately, it's also the quality of the work. So you can have a sliding scale of, adaptation versus interpretation. You can have that sliding scale. The thing that, overall that matters the most is the quality of the work. Now, you're defending Shannara, and I would say, well, if it was so good, would it have gone to season 3? Would it still be on the air right now if it was so good?
Well, that's the argument for. Yeah. That's the argument for.
I'm sorry, bro. It wasn't good.
That's the argument for Firefly, though. It wasn't good. No, they
Fox,
buried it on.
Fox loved to cancel shows,
right, well,
man. Like they were the hatchet men of anything good.
So yeah, I mean, the only reason Shannara even exists is Game of Thrones, which. Yeah. There you go, right? Game of Thrones is probably it's not the Lord of the Rings discussion or the Shannara discussion. There's a scenario where like they were basing it on the novels until they ran out of novels, and then they were like, "All right, well, we'll just."
That was pure adaptation, and then like, oh boy, what do we do now?
And what's funny is, okay, so I don't know much of Game of Thrones, right? Like. I gave Song of Fire and Ice a chance, and as a book, it just didn't like. I wasn't in love with it. I watched season 1, and that's all I know. Like otherwise, all I know is I used to work with 2 massive Game of Thrones fans, and I was like, I don't really care about spoilers. I enjoy listening to the conversation, and it's almost as if for the first time, popular culture got to experience nerd culture. And I'm not saying like, oh, but Star Wars and oh, but this. No, I'm talking for the first time, mainstream normies. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but normies, right?
That's a triggering word. You should take that back.
I'm not.
On this podcast of all things, throwing out normies.
Anyway, so, but they were experiencing what it's like to take those deep dives. They were listening to podcasts. They were reading articles. They were like, even though they had read the books. Even though a lot of the fans had read the books and knew what was going to happen, they were still invested in like the differences. And then you come to a head and it's like, well, Martin's like done. Like, I mean, to be fair, there's a part of me that feels like he's like, well, I don't have to finish it. Like, I don't want to pick on him.
I have a friend who's adamant that Winds of Winter is already done, and I don't want to laugh at him and totally like mock and crush his dreams. But it's like, yeah, I wouldn't bet the farm on that. But
I mean, he became a celebrity. It's all right. So I will give Martin a pass because Terry Brooks didn't become a celebrity before he finished the trilogy, and Tolkien didn't become a celebrity. They became a celebrity
much after,
right? Even if it became a bestseller or the trilogy was a bestseller, it was when it was done that people start. And he's kind of behind the 8 ball because we're in this 24/7 news cycle where he's writing these books, which are an older medium. Like you don't just sit down for a weekend and write a Song of Fire and Ice. Like, that's not how it works.
I think there's a danger when writers try to position themselves as rock stars. That's not a good thing. I was a big fan of Patrick Rothfuss and his The Name of the Wind series, I believe. And I love books 1 and 2.
By the way, not a series, okay? I'm going to say this right now. I haven't read either of the books, but I do know it's a cult. All right.
From what I could,
it's
it
a
is.
cult.
Straight up.
Everybody tells me, and I listen. It's on a shelf in this house that I'm recording in. Right. The Name of the Wind is here. I will at some point pick it up, but the more people who have read it go like it'll change you.
Well, I think that's
such
a bit hyperbole, but
fine. But everybody, like, it's such a cult. Like, I mean, I don't even say like you have to read Lord of the Rings. If I think you'll like it, I suggest it. But anybody who I've run into that, it's like a cult with that book.
it's very good. The point I would make is, with again writers trying to be rock stars, is Rothfuss is trying to, ship this out and try to get it televised or, get his baby out there, but the baby's not even out of the womb yet. Like, the story's not done. And meanwhile, like, how many fans have, like, literally, like, just sat around like, okay, it's this year. This year is going to be the year. It's going to come out. The last book, right? And no, it's just, and God, it's been what? How many years now? It's been a number of years.
But it takes me back to one of my favorite incomplete series. The Great and Secret Show is the Book of the Art #1, okay? By Clive Barker. Everville is the Book of Art Part 2. It doesn't feel at the end, without spoiling anything, it doesn't feel like at the end of Everville that it's done. And I would love Barker to write the Book of Art #3. He's already a rock star, okay?
Well, depending on how you interpret the book. I mean, I haven't read. I'm pretty sure I didn't read Everville. Like, to much to your disappointment, it's one of those things on a to-do list. You got me reading Dayton, man. So like, I love Dayton. So
Victory.
Yeah, there's only so many things I can read and only so many things I can watch. But I would just say it really depends on how the book ends. If it leads to that third parter, or if you're just satisfied with the two.
I mean, I was satisfied with The Great and Secret Show for the longest time until I realized that that's what Everville was, and I was like, well, I have to. But I also know it was adapted into The Great and Secret Show anyway. It was adapted into a graphic novel, and I've picked it up occasionally, like maybe in on sale, but I'll never buy it. And other than flipping through the pages and be like, oh, I know what scene that is and whatever. Like, I don't want it. I mean, and it gets to a different discussion, which is and I probably would have said, I don't know if I would have said Lord of the Rings, right? I had Bakshi's Lord of the Rings. I'd seen Rankin and Bass's Hobbit. Like, I wouldn't have said, like, don't touch Tolkien. I wouldn't have said it. Like, it had been touched. It had been done well. I don't want anybody to touch The Great and Secret Show. I don't. In fact, to be fair, I would have said the same thing about American Gods, which is why I haven't watched the series yet, because to me, American Gods is especially for those of us that are readers, and I grant you, not everybody is a reader, and I'm not picking on you if you're not. But if you are, we have special relationships with certain books.
Oh, yeah.
For me, do not bring The Great and Secret Show to any screen. Don't touch it. Just don't touch it. It's a book. Leave it alone. Leave it alone. And there are things, as we talk about these other ones, that, like, all right, maybe you can see it, right? But they're not all created equal.
Oh, no. And I think that's a wonderful line to say, that all adaptations are not created equal. Like, it's...
Well, let's get into a couple. So we talked about Game of Thrones.
Yep.
Talked about Shannara. Talked about Tolkien. I've seen half of a Harry Potter movie, and I haven't read any of the books. But as I understand it, those are done very well.
Yeah.
All around, right? Like, they were handled very well. Chronicles of Narnia is very different by comparison than Harry Potter or Game of Thrones, right? Because Chronicles of Narnia had been done before. Like, before the mainstream, like, whoever did it in the last decade, and we got a couple films out of it. It had been done by the BBC, maybe once or twice. I don't know how many times, but it had been done, right? So it was not... It's kind of like the Bakshi doing Tolkien. Like, it had been done when Peter Jackson takes it over. So I guess it softens up the ground. So anybody who was like, don't touch this, and you see at least an honest interpretation.
Yeah, someone
or a straight adaptation. You go, all right, I'm a little bit... So that's a little bit different, but like in order to have this discussion, we have to get out of fantasy, because fantasy is not the only place where the novel comes first.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about a couple things.
Sure.
Did you read Jurassic Park?
I did not read Michael Crichton growing up.
Have you read it since? Do you have an interest?
For some of the more corporate kind of intrigue that doesn't get as much play in the movies, that kind of fascinates me.
So like, because Jurassic Park is on my short list of I'm going to read this in 2020 because I've been meaning to get back to the source material. I read that book when I was way too young. So, and way too young, meaning like I was 12, right? So while I kind of could
follow... Your takeaway was like, oh, dinosaurs.
No, my takeaway was I kind of understand the science, right? Like I understand there's a scene I remember vividly. The only scene I remember from the book is like Dr. Grant injects an egg because raptors, not really carnivores, are more like scavengers, and he injects an egg with some kind of something, and the raptor eats it, and they escape because it knocks out. There's something like that, right? Look, it's been I'm 2 decades removed from 12. All right, so but I do know that there's a lot of in-gen corporate intrigue, right? Yeah. And so I want to reread the books because I also know that like I got a kick out of InGen being such a bigger part of the Jurassic World series.
The movies too. That part of it's getting a lot more play now.
And I for one really like that. I want to see how much was from the source material because we know we're getting the next what I'm hoping. Listen, I know everybody said like, oh, don't beat a dead horse. I'm all right with it. Like, give me dinosaurs, I'm fine. But like, I do hope like we end it at 3. Like 3's enough. Like I get where you're going. I really like where they're going. But that's a book that I really liked, even without understanding it. And hey, you know what? I fell in love with the movies. Like absolutely fell in love with the movies. But you have to talk about it because there are some vast differences between book and movie there. Like vast differences.
But again, the big takeaway was it was an amazing movie. The choices that they made contributed to the movie just being great. They took, the best parts from the book. They inserted it in the film in such a way that it was a spectacle. They got the most bang out of their buck.
All right, well, let me bring to you the most recent spectacle, what I will call the most recent spectacle, from book to movie, Ready Player One. And what's more fascinating about Ready Player One is the turnaround. Ready Player One comes out and becomes a bestseller and basically overnight gets a movie deal. Like, immediately. Did you read it, first of all?
No, didn't read it. I know you were pushing me to read it. Haven't read it yet.
I mean, that's probably what I'm buying you this year at some point for some reason. Like, I don't buy you gifts, really. I just buy you stuff that I like. You need to have this.
There's practical applications.
And that's how I got you into dating.
Yeah,
right?
We don't, as friends, we've never just gotten ourselves things that just have no purpose.
And it also hasn't been like, here's a holiday gift, here's a birthday gift. No, I literally went like,
yeah. You need to read
I'm getting you into Dayton. Here's a copy.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Ready Player One's going to be on the list then. But that's one where there are decisions made in pacing because what you can accomplish in 90 minutes on a movie screen, you might be able to get away with, this is a day and this is a day and then a few weeks later, right? But you can't go into every little detail. And yes, you can go back on agentpalmer.com and see that I had some issues with that film. But that was written 30 minutes after, like, I left the theater, I came home. And
First impressions.
I was steaming, and I was like, all right. I mean, I own it. I've watched it again. It's not...
That lingering purist in you just had to get the pen out.
I need to, I need to vent. Like, listen, if you want to talk to me about whether you should watch a movie, do not ask me 30 minutes after I've watched the film.
Yeah.
Ask me a year later when I own it, I've watched it. It's not just a big screen spectacle. But there's a part of me that I think will always be a purist. Like I guess I can't get away from some of those things. But I can, and I this is, do you think it has any difference at all whether it's a series or a film? Right? Like if they had made Game of Thrones, not an HBO series, but
you could never do it in a movie, man.
But my point is, do we treat adaptations differently based on how they get adapted?
Yeah, I would say one of my favorite examples would be the prequel trilogy for Star Wars and the Clone Wars, the animated series that came out. Like, you have this material that's set up by the movies, and then you have, I think, a couple years down the road, the animated series comes out.
Yep.
And what they do over the course of that series, they flesh out that world and that time. And unfortunately, with just having only the 3 movies to build up that galaxy and that conflict, you're not really able to do it the service it needs. So George Lucas got a lot of flack for those movies, but what he set up and what came afterwards was really good stuff. So it just needed the right medium to make it really shine. I don't think you can. It's just too and I think that even the new movies are suffering from the same thing. It's just so much stuff to explain, and you just can't really do it justice in a movie format. I would love like a book series, or if they come afterwards with like an animated series for what's. I love to see Rey in anything. I'm quite a fan of.
I guess
Daisy Ridley.
The issue then becomes we're all right with adaptation, and we're all right with guessing too, right? Because there are millions upon millions of pages written about the Star Wars universe that, whether you argue that they're canon or not, like it exists.
According to the mouse, it doesn't, and the mouse decides all.
But it exists, and my point is, you don't have to make stuff up. Somebody's already done that, and you can read it and determine the validity of it. Versus, we go back to the Shannara Chronicles, especially after that first season, they're making it up, but they're literally like they're it. Like you can't read a bunch of novelizations and get a bigger feel for the world. All you can do is keep reading ahead, which is, it's all a timeline. So it's all either in the future or the past. You can't build up the in-between with anything more than what you've already established in the 2 adjoining books, before and after. But I feel like there's a lot more that can go wrong. It's like a no-win situation, right? You can take 3 movies in the prequels and go build up too fast and too quickly. And you can make decisions based on, the economic impact of some of those decisions, with us seeing the, political spectrum in Star Wars was too much. But it has an impact on the story. Maybe it should be downplayed, whatever. But you have to make decisions. You get at the time, you get 90 minutes. Now you get 2 hours. Still, you only have a finite amount of time.
Bring your decatheter, folks.
Versus you have a series where you can expound on a little bit. If you want to, you can expound on more.
Yeah. And again, it goes towards whether or not how much of a passion project it is, and if you have the right people involved in that project. Again, with Lord of the Rings, casting, soundtrack, setting, the actual location where they filmed, New Zealand, all of these things came together to make that, again, one of the best adaptations ever, one of the best movies ever. Now, you're working with something like a property with Star Wars. It's frustrating because in the OG series, you had more practical effects, you had more puppetry, you had more practical set designs. The newer films, it's more CGI.
But they're going to it. That was the big thing. I remember when, prior to The Force Awakens being released, they made a big deal about the fact that they were going to do practical effects when possible.
Yeah.
Not
They're trying
not
to go
within
back.
budget.
Yeah.
Just when possible.
Yeah.
So we'll spend a little bit more money to make the real puppet if we can.
Yeah.
And I think that in Star Wars that's important because there's an authenticity that's required of what we're seeing on the screen. It doesn't exist in everything. I don't think that you need to do that in I don't think it's a rule for like all of Hollywood. I don't think you need to go practical. Listen, if you can save a few bucks, it depends on the world you're building too.
Yeah, especially with certain established characters, there's a big difference between practical effects Jabba the Hutt and CG Jabba the Hutt. And I think anyone who has seen the newer movies and the recuts or I don't even know how they...
When Han walks over the
tail.
that
was... Oh, it's cringy. It was cringy. It was bad.
All right. Well, let's go on to a better adaptation from panel to screen. And that is the MCU. Even and DC for that matter. We'll just go comic book movies in general because I feel like given the source material, and you can argue, via movie and via character and via who's playing the character, a la Batman, like how authentic it is. But I mean, most of them, and it goes to your point, most of them seem like passion projects for the people that were in them, or at least the directors and the writers.
Yeah. And,
they did all right.
And certain projects, yes and no. I think especially with Nolan's trilogy, oh, wow. Like, you could tell Nolan came out swinging. Like, he wanted this to be the quintessential superhero trilogy. And it's hard. It's hard to beat it. Say what you will about the back row, it's...
I guess the question ends up being like, well, Tim Burton didn't do bad. I mean, everybody talks about Nolan's trilogy, but like Burton he did 2 films, but we could say that first one is damn near as perfect as of a debut for a superhero film as ever there was, especially when you consider that as a character, that was a character that was camp. Like pure camp. Outside of the panel, 66 kind of took all the seriousness away from Batman.
Adam West, yeah, the television series, Burt Ward, his Robin, yeah. And it's one of the funny things that, some of the more theater-centric people I talk to say, it's the new kind of like Macbeth. Like, who are you having playing Macbeth? Who's playing Duncan? And that's the fun thing because everyone's going to have their favorite Macbeth now. Like, everyone's like, oh, Christian Bale's my favorite Batman. Oh, no. It's Michael Keaton. You got to go Michael Keaton for Batman. Val Kilmer. I don't,
Who is your favorite?
That's tough. If I had a gun pressed to my head, I'd have to go with Christian Bale.
All right.
Like, I think his Bruce Wayne and his Batman were very good. Don't like the back row. Like, I think they should just.
Right. Hey, listen, you be you, man. I mean, I'm a Keaton man all the way, right?
Yeah.
But right. So that's from comics to big screen. But you could say the same thing about Bond, right? Which is from novel to screen. And I don't know. It's very odd, right? Because we have a finite amount of James Bond novels. Kind of like Game of Thrones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've gone past the source material as far as James Bond goes. We have. And, Fleming didn't write GoldenEye. Are you kidding me?
No, he did not.
And
most certainly did not.
But I thoroughly love it.
Which is a complete interpretation. It's this is the only thing about that movie is James Bond and kind of like the spy universe that he exists in. You still get MI6, you still get M, you still have all of that.
Still get Q, absolutely.
Yeah, but beyond that, it's just a whole new take on it's a new story. It's new, and it was amazing. It was so good. Pierce Brosnan, James Bond, up until recently with Daniel Craig, you look back, it was like, okay, Bronson's up there, man. It's like it's hard to figure out who's on top. Like who gets the top pick there?
I mean, I know a lot of like when you talk about Bond purists, a lot of them say Roger Moore. But, I like Connery. I like Brosnan. Craig's lower in my list.
I know he
for
is.
you.
He's higher in mine.
But have you read any of the books?
Dear God, I think maybe Casino Royale, but that's.
Well, I mean, it leads me to this question. Do you want to? I mean, we talked a little bit about Jurassic Park, right? We talked a little bit about Ready Player One. Most of the other things you've read a little bit of, right? Like, I know you and I went to the same early education places. Like, I was forced to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
That's the one thing I'll say about our school, because I don't know if the internet knows this, but we both went to the same school.
We did.
Yes. And I would say their reading program was amazing. Like, I don't know what's happening now, but I know for damn sure that in terms of what I was, made to read, I read some really good stuff. So, tip of the hat, for that.
And that I'm just saying, like, we've talked about source materials. Do you want to go back for the ones you've missed and read the source material? I know, maybe not like, I'm not talking like Game of Thrones, Harry Potter level. I'm talking Ready Player One. It's one book.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like in that scenario, or like James Bond to go check out another book. Like, does that exist? Like, do you see these property or do you just see a movie, right? Like, I mean, one of them, I haven't read the book, but like Red Sparrow. I saw that movie and I went, I kind of be interested in the book if it exists. And it does. That one's based off of a book. Like, do you watch films and you go like, do you wait like till the end of the credits and see like based on a novel by like, and does that make you want to go pick it up ever?
It depends. In terms of if it really depends on if it grabs me. If I really like it, it may get me interested in taking a look at it. The genre too. Like sometimes I just go to see a movie because I hear good things about it. It may not be a genre I typically associate with something I'm going to read. Besides Dayton, I'm not really a big spy guy in terms of, reading novels.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I there's a part of me that wants to get back into the Bond because I know a little bit about Fleming, and I think it would be very interesting in the era and age we are, the modern era, the modern age, to go back and read something written in the 60s.
Cold War. Yeah.
I'm not even thinking Cold War. I'm thinking like, pre-women's movement. Like, boy, this is going to be very interesting to read.
Yes. And that has so much play and so much, it makes things very interesting because you and I were talking about this before about Lord of the Rings. Now, if they were to make Lord of the Rings now, I can tell you
they're going to gender swap a character.
Possibly. I just think Arwen's going to be like there the whole time though. I think she's going to be.
Oh, so you don't think, okay, because I mean, that's the thing that we end up with in terms of, listen,
you see a lot more of her, and she's going to be fighting a lot more.
And I don't have an issue with strong women. My issue is, can't we come up with some original characters for them? Like, my issue with gender swapping is I feel like it takes away from the character you're changing, and you're saying that you couldn't come up with anything better. Like, I'm not against it either, but what I am saying is, like, when you say we're going to have a female James Bond, you can't come up with a female spy. You can't originally create a female spy of that level. You have to say, well, we'll just make James Bond a woman. Like, and I have an issue with that because now we're back to interpretation.
Yes.
Well, it's just a character. It's just a badass character. Their gender has absolutely nothing to do with it. And I mean, for a lot of characters, it does. Like, it matters.
Yes, it does. It does.
So I thought you were going to say that if we redo Lord of the Rings now, Legolas is a woman because that's the easy swap, right? Like,
I think a lot of Orlando Bloom fangirls out there would be very angry and upset right now.
Listen, they still have Pirates of the Caribbean.
You can't take that away from them. Legolas was again that cast. Those John Rhys Davies, Viggo Mortensen, and Orlando Bloom. Man, those three.
All right, I want to
MVPs. But I will say real quick, just to keep on topic with Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit of all things. You were talking about how they would try to break up the sausage fest. Tariel the elf.
Sure.
Brand new interpretation. They brought a brand new character in to kind of mix it up.
She does exist in the universe in the books, but not along that storyline.
No.
Or even that timeline for that matter.
Evangeline Lilly, I believe, played her, and wow.
Listen, I mean, you are starting to, and especially with a Lord of the Rings series on the way, there are a select few actors that are starting to bridge multiple universes, and universe building is in, people. So that's all they want. But I want to take a left turn and talk to you about an interpretation, because it's not an adaptation.
Okay.
Of a very, very, very classic read that you and I both have a soft spot for. I don't know how many people have read Beowulf.
Oh my God, Beowulf.
But Beowulf is classic literature. And you and I, we grew up watching B movies. And when we found Beowulf starring Christopher Lambert, that was like the pinnacle as far as fantasy. I mean, Peter Jackson's one and the same to us. As far as B movie horror, it's Dead Alive. But that Beowulf is something that I own because we kept watching it over. Like, we couldn't get enough of it.
It was,
and it's not. It's definitely it's not an adaptation by any stretch. That's an interpretation. I read this book and went, all right, okay, I'm gonna keep I'll keep the outline, but I'm not gonna fill it in with anything remotely close to the source material.
No. But it was Kraft macaroni and cheese, but it was the cheese was so good. You didn't want to say no to the cheese.
All I'm saying is we're not snobs here. Like, we do enjoy some of the rough interpretations as well. It depends on the source material. It's also why
it's taste too. Like, it depends on, you got to know what you're getting, where you're rolling into. If you're gonna like posit this as, this is this epic, it's gonna be this epic film, and it's just, and you're trying to posit something as, a great thing, it better be a great thing. If you're gonna play a certain role and this role is hyped up and you just stink at it, George Clooney Batman. And he's owned up to it. It's like, yeah, I was the worst Batman ever. And he'll even say that in person, which, thank God he's honest about it. But I think it's all about expectation and the bottom line. Is this good or is it bad? And being honest about it. And then being satisfied with that result. Beowulf, hey, it's cheesy. It's pretty bad, but I gotta watch it.
Well, that one.
Yeah.
That one.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't vouch for any of the other versions that are out there, but for that one, absolutely. And listen, the same goes for like the classics of Dracula and Frankenstein. I'm sure there are faithful adaptations.
Christopher Lee versus Bela Lugosi,
Well, there are these faithful adaptations, but there's also rough interpretations, like Dracula 3000, 2000, whatever what was the one where he was a rock star?
That wasn't Dracula. That was the Vampire Lestat.
Oh, okay.
And that was we could totally do such a dive on that.
It's a separate.
Dude. That's.
Do you want a moment?
If you would allow me a moment,
go for
sir.
it.
If you allow me a moment. The Anne Rice original trilogy of her vampires. Great stuff, like really good stuff. The Vampire Lestat, one of the more epic vampires in literature, in several of her books. Amazing character. In terms of the movies,
That sigh. Oh my God. Like, I feel like that sigh, like, says, I don't think you need to say anything. Like, everybody can appreciate what you just did.
yeah, Interview with a Vampire, amazing. Again, a fine mix of the adaptation and interpretation.
Okay.
Like, in terms of casting decisions, in terms of the pacing of the story, because with Interview, it's more through the vampire Luis's perspective, and you have a lot of Lestat in there. So it was kind of interesting how they kind of balanced that. Queen of the Damned that's really on the other scale of things. That's just solely on an interpretation. And then again, there was a lot of just dialogue and pacing, and there's a lot of just issues with what they were trying to do. It was a mishmash between the Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned. 2 books crammed into one movie. It was never gonna fly. It was just no.
But we see that, though. There are times, and I can't, there aren't any others that come to mind, but I know that people have smashed books together in order to make it work. Listen, I've never been there, right? But I do understand the concept of trying to sell anything and being told, all right, you get one shot at this, and being like, well, I love these 2 books. I mean, I can always try and make both. And listen, maybe the end result isn't good, but I'm never going to question the initial, like, oh, I want to do this. Because there are books that if I could, I'd absolutely do this. But like, you only get one shot. All right, well, can I pepper in some from this other book too? Which same character. Don't worry. Like, I'm not inventing stuff. Yeah, I understand, right? We talked about I got you into Dayton. Listen, the movie IPCRESS File and the book IPCRESS File might as well not have anything in common. Like, they've got names in common.
Yeah.
That's it. And you see that where...
But they're both still very good.
They're both still very good, but I don't know if I would call either one an interpretation. I guess it would be a loose interpretation. It's definitely not a straight adaptation.
No.
But these things exist. Like, they just do. And look, I mean, I would encourage everybody to read more. I feel like everybody should read more.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where there's like 2 really big things in play with that. It's time, because everyone's just like running around like crazy folk anymore, and it's the mediums that are available. I think right now there's just so much audio visual stuff out there that's it's our primate brain. It's like, ooh, that's colorful and it's moving around. I wanna look at that.
Well, I mean, I treat reading as a way to consume something without screen time, because I don't want to stare at a screen for every waking hour. And so all of my books, there have been a few exceptions. Occasionally, as like a big victory for me as a blogger, I get like an advanced copy of a book. And sometimes it's just a manuscript and here's a PDF. So then I'll read it digitally on like a Kindle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, and it's only happened twice, right? So, but outside of those 2 times, unless it's like a Kindle exclusive, which I've read a few, I buy the book. I physically want to see my bookmark make its journey through the pages. I want to hold it.
The tactile sensation.
There is something about
therapeutic.
It. I have no issue with those people who say, I don't have that kind of time, but I have a 20-minute commute and I will listen to an audiobook. By all means, do that. And, whatever you do, don't turn this podcast off to go listen to your audiobook, please.
Simple plug.
But, like, I do think people should get to the source material. And, listen, don't be fooled. There are novelizations of movies you've already seen. Don't buy the novelizations. In that scenario, just watch the movie.
Yes.
But if you can get to the source material, if you can go back and read Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, do so. Like, I highly encourage you. It's different, right?
If you've made the mistake of watching the Shannara series on your telly, by all means, please pick up the book.
I mean, listen, Terry Brooks would be very happy, and I would tell you to start with the sword, even though, as I stated way too fervently, like, you don't need the third, but it is good. Like, there are things, right? And as we record this, I'm 2 trilogies into my Brooks initiation.
You're making ground.
And I've got the 3rd one on my shelf, so that one I will get to.
The Voyage of the J.R.R. Shannara.
And I'm completely hooked. And it's light reading. Like, for anybody who's read Tolkien or is maybe intimidated by Tolkien, he can be a bit wordy. Terry Brooks is like a breath of fresh air. It's just, here's the story. And yes, there's detail and he sets the scene, but you very rarely get the genealogy. He's not, the genealogy is only mentioned when it's important and it's part of the story.
Yeah.
Not, oh, and this is Jason, son of who, whatever. Like, that's what you get in Tolkien, and I've read it and I still like it, but sometimes you need something a little lighter, and Terry Brooks is the perfect balance. So by all means, go out there, get Sword of Shannara is the first book of the first trilogy. Do yourself a favor. And if you've watched the series
and you need therapy,
which is book 2, as we've mentioned, start with the original source material. There are some things that do make more sense that way. Jay.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions of, like, source material for anything remotely close to popular culture that people should check out?
That's a good question. I would say a lot of the things we've kind of discussed today touch on that, like with my love of Anne Rice, Terry Brooks, those series. It's I don't think there's any like fast or quick rule when it comes to that. Like, anything that I would really suggest. It's just there's just too much personal preference when it comes to that.
That's fair. I will say that I think 9 times out of 10, if you've seen it on the big screen and it is adapted from a novel, I'm not going to say the novel will be better because, again, you don't know if you don't know that the novel exists, and you watch the credits at the end and it says based on a novel by author X, then you're not going to know if it was interpretation or adaptation. But there will always be more in the book, right? This is not refuted. There will never be a time when you go to the movies, watch a 90-minute thing based on a book and go, all right, well, I don't need to read the book because they're clear. If you liked it, there's more where that came from. Go to the source material.
Yeah.
Something I realized that Zapata and I only touched on that is very important to note is the romanticism of reading. We talked about the tactile feel of reading a real book, but there is also an intimacy. That book is read on the couch, in your bed, even in your bathroom, and every other place imaginable. Reading a book is an intimate experience. In fact, I would argue that it's hard to get the same experience with audiobooks or listening to podcasts because when you are reading, you are reading. You can't read a physical book and wash the dishes or lift weights at the gym or drive your car. That intimacy is another arrow in the quiver for why books are better than their adaptations or interpretations, and at the same time, reading shouldn't be intimidating. Just as Sean and I talked about fine art and the curating of your own personal collection in your house shouldn't be unattainable, neither should reading. And while you may choose audible.com and audiobooks, it's still better than just watching the film, or at least you'll get more out of it. And as the case is with fine art, do not compare yourself with others. Your taste in art is your taste in art, and the way you read is the way you read. If I read 3 books in the time it takes you to read 1, I'm not going to pick on you. We read at different speeds. We comprehend differently. And we have our own opinions as well. It also depends on the book. Some are easier to read than others. Don't compare. Just don't. But to the idea that nerd culture is becoming popular culture, well, nerd culture has permeated the box office and our television screens, but there will always be hardcore nerds, and with each acceptance, we double down into ourselves. I'll say it, I'm a nerd/geek elitist. It's who I am. I'm as proud of that badge as I was back in the day when I was just a plain old nerd or geek. Taking ownership of our identity badges means they have no power in the hands of others. Now, before I get to the official business, I'd like to give out some book recommendations because what good is saying that reading is important if I'm not going to suggest a few things? We mentioned Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show during the episode, but Galilee is a wonderful novel. Chuck Klosterman is a favorite author of mine as well, so I'd also suggest you start with his Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. Douglas Copeland's Microsurfs is intriguing, and for anyone out there who is interested in the old space programs of Apollo and the moonshot era and the space race, Apollo 11 Command Module pilot Michael Collins' autobiography, Carrying the Fire, is a fantastic read, despite the fact that he wasn't even on the lunar surface. And lastly, may I suggest that you ask your friends and family what they are reading. This week's guest Zapata, plus my other friends and family, have all recommended books. Use the people you know who read as your greatest resource. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, Episode 9. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join in the discussion. Let me know what you think. You can tweet the show at The Palmer Files. You can tweet myself at Agent Palmer. And you can reach this week's guest, Jason Zapata, at Zapata Wordsmith. You can also visit his website, jasonzapata.com. The show email is thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And don't forget to visit agentpalmer.com to see what else I've got going on. You can also hear more of me in the meantime on Our Liner Notes, a musical conversation podcast with host Chris Meyer, and my new gig as co-host of the Podcast Digest with Dan Lizette. All right, Jason, Mr. Zapata, do you have one final question for me?
I do. It's diabolical. How bad of an interpretation were the Bay former films for you?
Ooh. All right. So.
And who made you watch them?
You made me watch them.
Guilty as charged.
It's funny because I didn't. Because it was not necessarily book or comic, to screen. I didn't. That's a screen to screen interpretation. It didn't.
G1, you had the animation.
I know, but it didn't make my list when I was coming prepared for this episode because I didn't think about, something old being redone. Which, listen, we're doing that. Like they did it. G.I. Joe was redone, and. Listen, that first, I will say this because I just avoided them for ever. And it took you and Mr. Chris Hughes. I was visiting you and you were like, you had mentioned it to Chris, I think. And you were like, he hasn't seen it. And the two of you were like, "You're watching this." It was the two of you.
Yeah,
you used each other as allies. You came together, and you were like, "No, he's watching this." And look at that first one. There is an authenticness to that first one that still resonates. Now, listen, it's never going to replace 86 for me. It's never. Yeah. Okay, there's something extremely poetic and operatic about that first one, and it's not just because it's cheesy 80s music. Like Orson Welles as the villain, as Unicron, will probably never be. He should be the #1 animated villain of all time.
Ooh, that's a lofty claim.
I know what I just said.
Ooh,
I know.
I think the internet's gonna have problems with that.
I know. But that is, for me, like, that's where it is tops. But you know what? That first one, fine. You and I saw the second one in the theaters together. And that's where you start to lose me.
Yeah,
like,
it starts to, quality-wise, you start to more in terms of the interpretation to a negative degree.
Except, right? There were 4 of those, right? 4? I don't know.
I think they were up to 5 now with the last one.
They did a lot.
They've done, yeah.
So the first one was good.
Second one was like
and then I really liked seeing Grimlock on the screen. That's like the only moment of some of those latter ones that I enjoyed at all was seeing Grimlock. Because Grimlock, King is like just that.
Yeah.
But Bumblebee was a return to form because there's this authenticness to that first one where Witwicky's character is not like a straight replacement for Daniel, but like he's basically a stand-in for Daniel. So like I understand all of that. It makes sense to me, which is why when you get to Bumblebee, there's this authentic nature to it that
when they
makes
went back
it
to
work.
and it's just basing it in the 80s, like what everyone's been doing. Like it's so funny, everyone's going back to the 80s. Like it's just like 80s is just like this warm, fuzzy, fleecy blanket of nerdy goodness that everyone's just going towards.
You're forgetting that in the 90s, while we were doing some crazy stuff of our own, like people looked back at the 60s fondly. Well, they did. The 60s, and it's weird because the 60s will always be that weird like point to this, but I think what we're getting at is that the 80s have basically replaced the 60s as the blanket of like comfort.
Yeah, and just to kind of circle back to Transformers, my just takeaway was I want to see Optimus Prime transform. That was my only takeaway. I was like, dude,
that was also the only thing you kept telling me.
Like,
you have to
just to see it.
Listen,
just to see it.
Listen,
and then the other thing, Peter Cullen voicing Optimus Prime and the line, "Freedom is the right of all sentient beings," in the Peter Cullen voice. Dude,
listen,
price of admission alone, folks. Price of admission alone.
Peter Cullen coming back to be Prime, great. Like I wish Megatron was the same voice. Like that was
a big
that bothered me.
Yeah,
and Starscream too was close, but not. It's just, but. I didn't need to see. Like, listen, it was all right. It's cool, right? I will admit it's cool. I didn't need it. I did not need to see Optimus Prime transform in quote unquote live action. I didn't need to. It was never like and that's probably why I didn't go seek out the first film in the theater to begin with, because I was like, nah, I don't. I watched him the last time he was in the theaters. I watched him die. Well, I don't need to go see it again.
I don't know how many Transformers nerds we have listening right now, but Optimus Prime dies like every other Tuesday. Like he dies all the time.
I mean, you know what? We're not doing this. We're not doing this. I will say though, real quick, since we're there, I had no problem, and this is where I get into like double standards. The live action Ninja Turtles, the first one.
What's the common denominator? Tell the audience.
I don't.
Bay.
No,
Michael.
That's the second one.
You're talking about the original 90s.
The original 90s live action one, I had no problem with. I liked it. I still watch it to this day. Again, there's something authentic about it. I still haven't watched the Bay ones because the Turtles have. I won't even listen. There are 3 ways I like my Ninja Turtles: in black and white on the page as they were meant to be, as the kids' cartoon it turned into, and that 90s live action, the first one, before the ninja rap, right? Everything after that transpired...
You don't like the ninja rap? Go ninja, go!
Stop.
I mean, how can you not?
This is why this is the problem with having somebody so close to you on this show, because you know too much.